Pearl Harbor, October 1940. Admiral James Richardson cables the Chief of Naval Operations, demanding to know why the heck he's here. In April, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had left its home base in California to conduct exercises in the Pacific. Then 1 month in, he'd received orders to issue a press release stating that he was remaining at Pearl Harbor on naval business. He's furious. He has no business here. And what he'd been told would be a 2-week stay has stretched to 6 months. Pearl Harbor is a forward station. It doesn't have the facilities to properly house, supply, or repair the fleet. Re-enlistments are down. Ammunition and fuel short. Morale has collapsed. Why is his fleet being left to rot? Finally, he gets an answer. President Roosevelt wants the fleet in Pearl Harbor as a deterrent against Japanese attack in the Dutch East Indies and to give America leverage in diplomatic negotiations. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is now a pawn in a high-stakes game, one where Roosevelt, unknowingly, is running out of time. This episode was made possible by the fine folks over at Total War, who are celebrating their franchise's 25th anniversary with massive sales on all their titles. But more on that after the episode. Hey everyone, quick note up top. This series will be drawing on 2 previous shows we've done about the history of Japan. Of course, you don't need to have watched them, but we're also not going to repeat some info on previous topics much. So, if you want extra background or just to brush up, you can check out our completed series on the end of the samurai and Japanese militarism. Links to those in the description, but now, on to the infamy. December 7th, 1941 is one of the most famous dates in world history. The day that the Empire of Japan attacked the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor, bringing an unaware America into World War II. That is, traditionally, how it's told in textbooks and documentaries. But it's not the full story, or even, in many ways, the real story of how and why these countries came to blows. Because mere weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, diplomats were still negotiating for peace, and even proposing that Roosevelt and Japanese Prime Minister Prince Konoye meet face to face. In fact, the road to December 7th was a crooked one, fraught with tense meetings, cultural misunderstandings, and dismissed warnings. A surprise attack that remained a surprise, even though the U.S. State Department had decrypted and was reading Japanese diplomatic cables about the operation. But to trace the roots of this conflict, we have to go back much further than 1940. We're heading back to the late 19th century, when both Japan and the United States emerged as Pacific empires. Both were late to Pacific colonialism. By the 1870s, Spanish colonies in the Philippines and the Marianas were already 3 centuries old, as were Dutch possessions in modern Indonesia. Heck, the British had been in Australia since the late 18th century. But the US and Japan, by contrast, had been constrained by internal factors, and only began to scramble for territory in the late 1800s. Japan, its centuries-long isolation ended by the expedition of American Commodore Perry, wanted to be counted among the great powers. And that meant establishing a colonial empire. It started slowly at first, with the addition of islands, such as Okinawa, that it considered part of its historical borders. Then it moved on to Taiwan, Korea, and Sakhalin Island, spoils of the First Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War. The United States had a similar delay, since it had only become a Pacific power in the 1840s when the Mexican-American War won it the Southwest and California, and a treaty with the UK ceded it the Oregon Country. Yet its first official forays into exerting power in its new Pacific domain, like Perry's expedition to Japan, were put on hold during the Civil War. But even then, U.S. expansionism continued, because U.S. interests in the Pacific were not initially territorial, but rather commercial and religious. Merchants trying to strike it rich in the China trade established trading enclaves, and American whalers spread across the Pacific from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Plus, New England missionaries set down on nearly every island and port city from Honolulu to Yokohama. So, though not officially part of the U.S. government or its plans, this American presence forced the State Department to set up embassies and consulates at a rapid pace to serve these Americans abroad. Not to mention, the purchase of Alaska in 1867 also increased American reach. But both the whaling industry and the China trade were dependent on reliable resupply stations, especially for the coal increasingly used to power ships. And since the best ports in the mid-Pacific, such as the Kingdom of Hawaii, imposed high taxes on refueling, the U.S. began looking for alternatives. It first claimed Midway Island, an uninhabited atoll that was part of the Hawaiian island chain in 1859, but the first efforts to dredge it into a useful harbor ended in disaster when the project failed and a naval vessel wrecked on return. So the US Navy began looking to a more suitable location. After all, would it not be helpful to set up a naval station inside the Kingdom of Hawaii? In 1875, during the reign of King Kalakaua, the Hawaiian government signed a free trade agreement with the United States, deepening the already largely American presence in Hawaii. But upon the agreement's renewal in 1887, America insisted in negotiations that the US Navy get exclusive rights to use an underdeveloped location as a coaling and repair station. The place, a pristine bay of several locks with lush oyster beds, would come to be called Pearl Harbor. Yet Pearl was inferior to the nearby commercial port of Honolulu Harbor, which could accept large, deep draft ships. By contrast, Pearl's entrance was shallow and mostly blocked by coral reef, with only a small entrance that had been cut by a native Hawaiian chief. And Congress didn't really want to shell out the money to develop it further. But then, in 1898, America's posture in the Pacific changed. In the wake of the Spanish-American War, a wave of empire-building politicians looked to the Pacific, no longer for commerce or conversion, but now territorial expansion. In 1893, a group of American businessmen and Hawaiian subjects of American descent staged a coup against the Hawaiian monarchy, with the goal of annexing the islands to the United States. However, when newly inaugurated President Grover Cleveland blocked annexation, the coup planners briefly formed a republic to wait for the US to elect an administration with a more expansionist mindset. And they got what they wanted in President William McKinley. See, when the United States took over Manila Bay in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War, it was clear to the McKinley administration that the Philippines would not be liberated, but made a territory of the United States. And needing a way station to support America's Asian territory, McKinley gladly accepted the offer of Hawaiian annexation, as well as seizing the formerly Spanish Guam and claiming Wake Island. Within months, the US had established a trans-Pacific empire with a reliable system of trade routes and way stations. Development work began at Pearl Harbor, with the Navy commencing dredging operations so it could finally accommodate large ships. And while the first dry dock collapsed in a 1913 engineering disaster, by 1919, Pearl Harbor finally became a functioning naval station. A functioning naval station that Japan looked on with unease. After all, they'd been thrust into this modern world by a visiting American fleet, and now they had the potential to have one at their doorstep. The combination of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines represented a new, potentially game-changing threat, allowing the US to project naval power across the Pacific and into Asia. But despite a few diplomatic incidents, things remained largely cordial between the US and Japan. The two fought on the same side during World War I, with Japan further expanding its colonial possessions in the Pacific Islands, gaining a mandate over German colonies after the war. Yet that was where things started to sour. During the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles, Japan led a push for a statement on racial equality in the treaty that the US knocked down. Similarly, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, meant to limit the size of fleets to prevent another arms race and world war, constrained Japan to having only 3 capital ships for every 5 the US and Britain possessed. While the London Naval Conference of 1930 loosened this ratio on heavy cruisers, making it 10-7, it was still rightly seen as an attempt to constrain Japanese naval power. It seriously inflamed both international relations between the two countries, as well as fueling hardline militarist parties in Japan. And in 1931, things shifted again, when Japanese officers staged the Mukden incident, using a false flag bomb attack on a rail line as a pretext to invade Chinese Manchuria. US diplomats at the League of Nations attempted to stop the invasion by invoking a peace pact Japan and China had signed in 1928. Yeah, that had no effect. So, declaring that Japan's actions had voided the Washington Naval Treaty, Secretary of State Henry Stimson announced that the US would no longer be bound by the arms agreement. A new naval arms race in the Pacific had begun, and its conclusion ran a straight line to 1941, right to the US Pacific Fleet languishing at Pearl Harbor. Yangtze River, December 12, 1937. The Japanese dive bomber lets its payload go, the bomb smashing into the bow of US Navy vessel USS Panay as sailors run to stations in disbelief. The US and Japan are not at war. Part of the US Navy's Asiatic Squadron, Panay is steaming away from the Chinese nationalist capital of Nanking, where it had evacuated civilians just before the city fell to the Japanese army. Now, it's escorting 3 standard oil tankers away from the burning city, fleeing reports of mass murder. Sailors run to shelter. One, still in his underwear, sprays machine gun fire at the fighters strafing the vessel. The captain is grievously wounded, and the vessel's second officer takes command, though moments later, shrapnel rips open his throat. He can't speak to issue orders, so he writes it on the bulkhead with his own blood. Abandoned ship. It's December 18th, and in Tokyo, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew is trying to prevent a war. Accords signed after the Boxer Rebellion had allowed U.S. Navy gunboats like the USS Panay to patrol Chinese rivers and protect American commerce. To attack one violated international law, and the details did not look good. Japanese planes had sunk the Panay, along with the 3 standard oil tanker ships, killing 3 Americans and wounding 48. They'd even machine-gunned the lifeboats. This despite the fact that the Panay had radioed its position to Japanese forces and marked itself with 3 large American flags. In the US, the public mood was one of indignation. While there was also anger at Japan for what was being called the Rape of Nanking, the public treated the attack on the Panay as an even worse affront, particularly because they saw it firsthand. Most of the evacuees from Nanking had been journalists, and one filmed the attack from the Panay's deck. Ambassador Grew worried that, if it escalates, this incident could lead to war. It felt like the USS Maine all over again. Especially since Grew's boss, President Franklin Roosevelt, was far more willing than his predecessors to confront what he privately called the bandit nations of Germany, Japan, and Italy. In October, Roosevelt had even given a speech calling for a quarantine of aggressive nations, arguing that America should take an active hand in containing the epidemic of world lawlessness. But Roosevelt had suffered such an isolationist backlash against that speech that even he hoped to defuse the Panay situation as quickly as possible. So, Grew reached out to contacts in Japan's civilian government and business community, as well as retired Admiral Nomura, who was connected to foreign policy circles. But no one seemed to know why the Panay had been attacked. Some said it was a mistake, while others said it might be a plot by low-level Japanese officers to scare American forces out of China. American radio intercepts suggested it was intentional. But Grew also found Japanese leaders receptive to his demand for an apology. Both Japan's government and public were mortified over the incident, and within days, the American embassy in Tokyo was besieged by letters of apology from Japanese citizens, including school children, along with envelopes stuffed with yen for the victims. On December 23rd, a Japanese delegation arrives at the U.S. Embassy to meet with Grew. They take full responsibility and designate a high-ranking naval officer to present a formal apology. In addition, they'll pay an indemnity of over $2 million to compensate the United States for the Panay and the 3 tankers. Yet they maintain that the attack was a case of misidentification. A pretty ludicrous position given the facts. But if it prevents a war, then it's a compromise Grew and Roosevelt are willing to make. The apology arrives in Washington on Christmas Day, the fury over the attack diffused by the holiday season. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats breathe a sigh of relief. For as much as Grew and Roosevelt want to avoid war, the Japanese government can't afford more complications in its Chinese quagmire. Despite early victories, it was becoming clear that in invading China, Japan had bitten off more than it could chew. The central government hadn't planned or even formally declared this war. It was capitulated into it by the actions of mid-level army officers, and there was no overall strategic plan or even an obvious goal. Instead, there were nebulous assertions about northern expansion and seizing resources, but the truth was, it was costing far more resources than it brought in, and the army's brazen massacres, like at Nanking, were wrecking Japanese diplomatic efforts, which was dangerous. Because the Chinese theater was a mess of international forces, none of which Japan could afford to antagonize. First, there were American and British river gunboats like Panay, literally sailing through the conflict. Then Germany was present too. Despite being part of an anti-communist pact with Japan, it sold the Chinese nationalists equipment and provided military advisors. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, wanting to support Mao's communists, had sent Soviet planes and pilots to shore up China's weak air forces and bomb Japanese bases. Which was double scary, since that risked Japan's greatest fear: war with the Soviet Union. And then there was the United States itself, which was playing both sides. Popular sympathy in the US lay solidly with China, seeing it as a victim of Japanese aggression, and the US government supported the nationalist cause with supplies routed through French Indochina. Yet paradoxically, America also supplied Japan with the high-grade fuel oil Japanese ships and planes used to pound nationalist forces. Any one of these powers risked getting dragged into the conflict. And despite what some militarist fanatics insisted, Japan could not simultaneously fight both a Western power and China. A thing that only became more clear as 1938 and 1939 dragged on, and Japan and China cut negotiations. Now it seemed the only path Japan had for victory was to conquer China. Japanese forces kept advancing, but now it was clear that nationalist leader Kai-shek was intentionally giving up territory, using the vastness of his country against them, so they had to commit more resources into holding it. And while the Japanese army was spread increasingly thin, they also had to deal with Maoist guerrillas, which sabotaged coal mines and other resources. Then in July 1939, the most terrifying thing of all occurred. A group of militarist officers posted near the border with Mongolia made an unsanctioned border incursion against the Soviets, hoping to trigger a conflict that would let Japan seize Siberia. Instead, the Soviets encircled and smashed the Japanese forces, making planners question whether Japan could truly stand up to the full might of a Western power. Japanese diplomats, including Admiral Nomura, hastily concluded the conflict by recognizing the Soviet view of border claims. But it wasn't even a month before yet another diplomatic crisis gripped Tokyo, when Germany and the Soviet Union announced a non-aggression pact. Now, that was, as geopolitical scholars term it, a real dick move. The anti-communist treaty was supposed to align Japan and Germany against the Soviets. And now, without even telling Japan, Germany had concluded an agreement that gave the USSR peace on its western border, which meant that the Soviets could, theoretically, turn all their attention toward invading Manchuria and Japan. Y'all, I'm starting to feel like this Hitler guy might be a little untrustworthy. Meanwhile, shipments of American aircraft parts were suddenly drying up. It turned out that Roosevelt, while not making any public announcement, had privately requested American aircraft manufacturers to stop selling to Japan. Then, in July of 1939, Roosevelt escalated by canceling America's commercial treaty with Japan, effective January 1940. Not only would this be a commercial hit, but it removed the legal protections against the United States declaring an embargo. What would happen, Japanese officials began to ask, if he shut off our oil? Yet in that dark period, a window of opportunity opened. Germany invaded Poland in 1939, plunging Europe into war, and by June 1940, had swept across France and the Netherlands. So while Japan's northern expansion strategy, favored by the army, had clearly failed, because China was a quagmire and the Soviets too dangerous, the Imperial Japanese Navy's rival strategy of striking down into Southeast Asia to seize the rubber-producing regions of British Malaya and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies was now suddenly possible. With the English, French, and Dutch busy fighting Germany, they wouldn't be reinforcing their positions halfway around the world. So for a brief time, the colonies of Asia appeared up for grabs. Japan could sweep in fast, just as Germany had overrun France. But that window might not be open for long. Heck, Germany itself might snap them up. The rallying cry, "Don't miss the bus!" echoed throughout the government, capturing the feeling of escalation and frantic activity. Japan's first step, it was decided, would be to move into French Indochina and cut the Western supply lines to nationalist China. And so as Nomura took a ship for Washington as his country's new ambassador, and Roosevelt mulled more sanctions, Japan drew up troops on the border with French Indochina, preparing for its third undeclared war in 3 years, a war that would put it on a collision course with the United States. Hanoi, September 22nd, 1940, 2000 hours. General Maurice Martin, commander of French forces in Indochina, sits in a humid meeting room with a general of the Imperial Japanese Army. They're working under a deadline, for in 2 hours, Japan will invade. This had started in June, just after France fell, with a demand from Foreign Minister Matsuoka to cease shipments across the border to China and allow Japanese border observers. But as the months dragged on, the ultimatum has increased. Now, Japan wants the border totally closed, and to station troops, ships, and warplanes in northern French Indochina. It's egregious, but Martin has little choice. The Japanese 22nd Army is ready to cross the border at 2200 hours. He makes a counteroffer. How about 6,000 Japanese troops, not 25,000? The general agrees. Whew! An hour before the deadline, word goes out that an agreement has been reached. But when the deadline comes, the 22nd Army invades anyway. Japanese diplomats hadn't expected the Indochina operation to go like that. Theoretically, this was supposed to be part of a diplomatic expansion south, one that was to be accomplished amicably through negotiation. After all, Japan was Germany's ally, and Germany now controlled France. I mean, why wouldn't France just let them in? But again, at this point, Japanese diplomats weren't really running the show. Rather, militarists in the cabinet were directing foreign policy now. And even though Foreign Minister Matsuoka, a man who'd led Japan's exit from the League of Nations, was himself a militarist, even he still had limited power. The military considered the civilian foreign ministry unreliable, and rarely shared their plans with Matsuoka or his subordinates. I mean, they'd sent a general to negotiate in Hanoi, not an ambassador. Meanwhile, low-level military officers were provoking conflicts again, like launching a needless invasion of French Indochina despite receiving word of a diplomatic solution. And to be clear, we're not talking about a small border skirmish here. We're talking a multi-day undeclared war with tank formations and amphibious assaults. Now, a few months later, the Foreign Ministry did successfully act as a mediator to end a short war between Thailand and French Indochina, but that didn't really change Japan's image as a military aggressor, and at the White House, Roosevelt most certainly still felt that way. Over that chaotic summer of 1940, he'd been taking all the actions he could, pitching them as defensive in order to avoid backlash from isolationists. In May, he'd stationed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, where it could credibly threaten Japan should it try to move south, a move the Navy disliked since it split their fleet and kept it far from its home base. He'd also made diplomatic and congressional moves on what would eventually become the Lend-Lease program, which you can watch our video about here, supplying the UK and other not-quite allies with old military equipment. And after the fall of France, he'd pushed a bill through Congress known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, expanding the U.S. Navy fleet size by 75%. Not only would this allow the U.S. to simultaneously fight a war in both the Atlantic and Pacific, the expansion focused on aircraft carriers and naval aviation, modernizing a badly aging fleet. In September, he reinstated the military draft, and he began efforts to harden American defenses in the Philippines and Guam, and transform the civilian airstrips on Midway and Wake Islands into Navy airbases. America would not seek a war, the reasoning went, but given the march of German and Japanese aggression, it needed to be ready to fight one. But after the aggression in Indochina, Roosevelt wanted to directly target the Japanese military. So, he expanded the embargoes of the Export Act to also cover iron and steel scrap, metals crucial for war production. In response, the Japanese ambassador in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, calling the metal embargo an unfriendly act. The United States was intervening in diplomatic negotiations between allies, he said, where it simply had no part. Besides, Japan was merely trying to stop illegal weapons shipments to the corrupt nationalist regime in China. But Hull knew that argument was a smokescreen, because a U.S. military program known as MAGIC had secretly broken Japan's new diplomatic cipher, Purple. While the decryptions weren't total, and many of the messages were difficult to understand due to code words and poor translations, one thing was clear. The moves in Indochina were part of an expansion south. Yet relations did briefly improve. In November, that ambassador was recalled and replaced with the genial Admiral Nomura, who immediately bonded with Roosevelt over their shared interest in naval matters. Furthermore, Hull and Nomura got along well, meeting regularly at Hull's apartment, where they could be more candid, and Nomura always kept an even temper, even when the two clashed, believing to his core that a conflict would be bad for both countries. But what Hull and even Nomura didn't realize was exactly how much Roosevelt's attempt at deterrence was in fact driving Japan closer to war with the United States. In Tokyo, military and civilian leaders were terrified over Roosevelt's expansion of naval power, because this wasn't just the US leaving behind the naval treaties of the 20s and 30s. This meant new American carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and airplanes coming off the production line every year for the next 5 years. Currently, the US and Japan had roughly equal navies, with Japan having a slight advantage in merchant vessels, but now that America was on a war-producing footing, that might only last a year or two. So an argument started to circulate. If a war was inevitable, why not fight it soon? After all, every day Japan waited, the US Navy was getting larger, and if Roosevelt cut their oil, the opposite would be true. Each day of non-combat operations would mean Japan had less fuel to fight. Japan's attempt to manufacture synthetic oil had failed, and when they made import deals with Mexico, the US leaned on its southern neighbor to get those canceled. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, had a solution. Deter US action by signing a tripartite pact with Europe's totalitarian states of Germany and Italy. Nazi diplomat von Ribbentrop had first suggested such a thing as early as 1938, and to Matsuoka, it made immediate sense. Germany was one of the few nations to recognize Japan's Manchurian puppet state. All three wanted to deter the US from joining the war, and by signaling a mutual defense pact, it meant America would need to fight a two-ocean conflict. Germany also pledged that the Pacific would be Japan's sphere of influence. Matsuoka's concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The idea that Japan would throw Western colonialists out of Asia and lead the region to prosperity. Though it should be noted, not everyone was on board with a Nazi alliance. In Tokyo, one colleague warned that Hitler was untrustworthy and routinely violated treaties. After all, Hitler had already broken his anti-communist pact with Japan by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he hadn't even bothered to inform Tokyo in advance. An alliance hadn't helped them in Indochina after all, and once the pact was signed, Matsuoka had to issue embarrassing statements saying Japan wouldn't be adopting Germany's anti-Semitic policies. But Matsuoka remained committed to the alliance, especially because he believed the Soviets could be enticed to join, forming a bloc of totalitarian nations to challenge the Western democracies. And in 1940, the alliance bore fruit. November 11th, 1940, 250 miles southwest of Sumatra. Officers of the German commerce raider Atlantis board the merchant vessel. They'd come upon it disguised as a fellow merchant ship, then fired at the bridge at close range, killing most of the command. Now they're taking passengers and crew aboard their own ship before scuttling it. But then, one of the passengers asks an officer if they could go get her family's tea set in the ship's vault. And when he agrees and goes to retrieve it, the officer finds more than just porcelain. 15 bags of top-secret mail destined for the British Far East Command. There are maps, decoders, intelligence reports, and a special bag filled with holes so it would sink when thrown overboard. Documents inside detail Britain's plans for the defense of Singapore, troop strength in the region, and how the colonies would fight a potential war. The assessment is grim. Currently, Britain cannot win a fight with Japan. All 15 bags were forwarded to Tokyo, their reception causing a massive stir. The Strike South plan was not only feasible, it should begin soon. But wait, what of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor? If Japan took the Dutch East Indies, it would surely respond. Yet a group of naval officers felt otherwise, arguing that the US fleet could be preemptively destroyed at the commencement of hostilities, giving Japan a year or two to consolidate its wins in Southeast Asia before having to fight the Americans in earnest. It was worth developing a contingency plan. After all, in November, the British had used a fleet of carrier-launched torpedo bombers to raid an Italian port. They should get someone to study that possibility. Lucky for them, one man was eager for the assignment: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Honolulu, Hawaii, April 12, 1941. Tadashi Morimura, the new vice consul at Japan's consulate general in Honolulu, is unusually daring for a civil servant. A private pilot, he rents small aircraft to fly around the island and swims the southern waterways. He also visits the geisha bars favored by local Japanese and visiting naval officers and loves chatting up the girls for gossip. And he lives unusually far away from work, 8 miles to be precise, in a second-floor apartment overlooking Pearl Harbor. Now, if that all sounds odd to you, there's a good reason. Because that identity is a cover. In reality, he's Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa of Imperial Japanese Naval Intelligence, a specialist in US Navy warships. His job is to provide descriptions of the harbor and monitor which vessels are in port. And he reports this information back to Tokyo via diplomatic cables. Cables that, he has no way of knowing, are being read by the American military. The countdown has started. April 13th, 1941. A train station in Moscow. Foreign Minister Matsuoka and the Japanese delegation are in high spirits. They're slapping backs, hugging, many of them a little intoxicated, after a celebration banquet. For half a century, Japan has feared an attack by Russia, but no more. Over the last several months, Matsuoka has been negotiating a non-aggression pact between Japan and the Soviet Union, and today they signed it. And as the conversation on the platform dwindles, Matsuoka turns to see an unbelievable sight. Walking through the crowd is Stalin himself, come to see Matsuoka off. This never happens. Stalin doesn't go to the train station to give diplomats a personal farewell. And it's at that moment that Matsuoka feels the weight of history, and how badly the Soviets wanted this arrangement. Now, Stalin can withdraw troops from its border with occupied Manchuria and send them west, and Japan, for its part, could remove their own troops and push south. But when Matsuoka arrives back in Tokyo, he found that plan had become a bit more complicated. For in Washington, Ambassador Nomura had hashed out a draft resolution that could normalize relations with the US. If Japan would agree to withdraw troops from China, merge its Chinese puppet state government with Chiang's nationalist government, and pledge to recognize Chinese independence, the United States was prepared to recognize Manchuria as a Japanese possession, normalize trade, and end racially discriminatory immigration laws. And Prime Minister Konoye was considering it. After all, he wanted out of the Chinese quagmire. And while it might come off as a betrayal of the Japanese soldiers who died in China, it could prevent thousands more from dying in a Pacific-wide conflict. Matsuoka was livid. He insisted that the draft be shown to their German allies and said that the time to attack British Singapore had come. After all, he'd spent over a year forging diplomatic agreements with Germany and the Soviets to keep the pressure off Japan. And what, now they were just gonna give in? Matsuoka started to go rogue. He made a counteroffer where Japan gave up nothing and started to denigrate Konoye in public. Worse still, once Nazi Germany broke its non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in late June, he insisted that Japan should abandon the Southern Strike and instead invade the USSR in support. Konoye, deeply embarrassed, had to personally apologize to the emperor for Matsuoka's conduct and give assurances he did not plan to provoke a war with Stalin. In fact, the fiery diplomat's presence had even become a sticking point in negotiations, with Secretary of State Cordell Hull suggesting that talks could not go forward with Matsuoka still in government. He also demanded that Japan quit the tripartite pact. And when Matsuoka started to act without consulting the cabinet, Konoye decided it was time for him to go. So his ministers dissolved the cabinet and reformed it without him. In Washington, Roosevelt and Hull were overjoyed. With Matsuoka out, perhaps this signaled a cooling off of military aggression. Their hope was misplaced. 4 days later, under the threat of military action, Japan had reached an agreement to occupy the southern portion of French Indochina, moving into air bases that would allow them to bomb British Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. A hard response was needed, and Roosevelt delivered. He announced he would formally cut relations, put an embargo on goods, and freeze all Japanese assets in the United States, with that last measure cutting all American oil sales to Japan. Yet days later, he gave Nomura a new offer: pull out of Indochina and make it a neutral territory, and the assets would be unfrozen. See, the US oil embargo wasn't a full embargo. That would leave Roosevelt without much flexibility in negotiations. Japan obtained American oil by buying licenses to purchase a certain volume, and Japan had already obtained enough licenses to keep them supplied until 1943. But that oil had to be paid with US currency, held in American banks, and those were the assets that were frozen. Though, technically, the Treasury Department could decide on a case-by-case basis to allow Japan's license purchases to go through. So Roosevelt could, essentially, loosen or tighten Japan's supply of oil in a carrot-and-stick approach. Nomura didn't even pass on the proposal to Tokyo, knowing that the militarists, especially Minister of War Hideki Tojo, had boxed Prime Minister Konoye in. On August 1st, the economic measures went into effect. Yet Roosevelt's measured approach was not followed. As he took a 2-week diplomatic visit to meet Churchill, the Treasury went hardline and denied all Japanese oil purchases. Then, given the popularity of this tough stance among friendly nations, Roosevelt retroactively endorsed it. What he didn't endorse, however, was coming to those nations' defense. All summer, British and Dutch diplomats had tried to get Roosevelt to commit, even informally, to fight together should Japan attack in Southeast Asia. American diplomats instead ducked, saying negotiations with Japan were ongoing and the time was not right. In truth, Roosevelt was unsure that the isolationist American public would support him going to war, even if Japan attacked. Would American parents, he wondered, accept their sons dying just to hold on to the Philippines or preserve British control of Singapore? At the time, probably not. But Roosevelt's attempt at deterring war again did the opposite. Now Japan was on the clock, with over 90% of its oil obtained from the US. If war was coming, every day they waited to strike south, they would have less fuel to operate with. Under wartime consumption patterns, they predicted they could only keep their ships moving and planes flying for a year. So, their options now were to either pull out of China, which the army wouldn't accept, or strike south. And yet, American negotiators dawdled. They were in no hurry, each day seeming as if their hand in a potential war grew stronger. Over the next several months, Prime Minister Konoye tried desperately to find a middle ground, including brokering a face-to-face meeting with Roosevelt in Alaska. Meanwhile, the planning for the strike south, with an optional attack on Pearl Harbor, advanced. The plan had gained formal approval as a contingency should negotiations fail, but militarists increasingly found that Emperor Hirohito did in fact favor a diplomatic solution. At a meeting on September 6, 1941, a militarist officer told Hirohito that a war with the United States would be over in 3 months. Not believing this, the emperor pushed back, saying that they'd said the same thing about China. "China is big," explained the officer. "Bigger than the Pacific?" the emperor responded. And he finished the meeting by reading a poem his grandfather, Emperor Meiji, had written on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War. A poem about how the sea linked all nations and should be at peace. But he did give his assent to war if diplomacy failed. And as the weeks dragged on without progress, and the Alaska summit looked doubtful, pressures began to mount. And at a conference on September 25th, Minister of War Tojo pushed for an internal deadline. If no diplomatic options were reached by mid-October, Japan must put in motion plans for a military solution. It was agreed. Fleets began to gather and make ready. October 12th, 1941, near Mount Fuji. Konoye has brought the biggest figures in government to his private estate for a last-ditch effort to prevent war. There, he leans on Tojo, saying that he's not confident a war with the United States can be won, and that he's not equipped to lead the country through it. He threatens to resign. He also enlists allies from the Navy, who privately oppose the war and think that defeat is likely, but who are also not brave enough to make their anti-war views known amongst their colleagues. The best he can get from them in the moment is to say that setting a deadline was a mistake, and that they'd asked for imperial approval of the strike too early. Tojo will not budge. The sticking point is what it's always been. The army refuses to pull troops out of China. Not only does Tojo see doing this as betraying the dead, but much of the army's political power is wrapped up in the war. After many contentious hours, the meeting breaks up. And 4 days later, Konoye resigns from his post, and the emperor appoints his successor, Hideki Tojo, who tells Admiral Yamamoto to begin preparing his strike force for war. Tokyo, November 5th, 1941, midnight. Saburo Kurusu quietly sits on his bed. Despite his caution, his wife Alice, an American who Kurusu met on assignment there, wakes. "I'm going to the United States, probably," Kurusu says. "When?" replies Alice. "Morning." He explains that American Ambassador Grew has called in a favor to delay a Pan Am flight out of Hong Kong so Kurusu could make it via naval plane. He is to be a special envoy delivering a peace proposal to Roosevelt. It's cold. Alice wraps a blanket around him. This mission will be a dangerous one. Militarists had plotted to assassinate Prime Minister Konoye due to his peace platform, and one diplomat had already been murdered for getting too close to Grew. So they decide their son, an army engineer, will ride the train with him. That way, reporters would think that Kurusu was seeing him off on a deployment. And the next morning, the two head out together, with Japan's last hope for peace sitting in Kurusu's briefcase. The appointment of Hideki Tojo as prime minister seemed to put Japan on an inevitable path to war. But ironically, behind the scenes, it was the peace faction that considered him the best candidate. After all, even if a diplomatic solution could be found, the new prime minister would need to be somebody with military pull. He would need to get the army on board with any agreement, and probably put down riots and attempted coups after the announcement of said agreement. And shockingly, it appeared they were right. Tojo himself was stunned by the appointment, and once in office, the enormity of Japan's predicament hit him. He now represented the whole country and realized how dubious the Navy was about whether they could win a war with the US. So at a series of high-level meetings in November, he reopened the question of a diplomatic solution. What could be done? Are we even sure we can win a war? What will be the consequences? He even proposed revisiting the decision from the Imperial Conference of September 6th, laying out that if diplomatic efforts failed, war would be declared on America, Britain, and the Netherlands. This was unbelievable. Reversing an imperial decision was unprecedented in Japanese history. These contentious meetings lasted for up to 14 hours at a time. Several civilian leaders even suggested a war would be so devastating, it would actually be preferable for Japan to accept a time of economic hardship and humiliation rather than fight one. Though army leaders shot back quick, saying the country was already rationing and food prices spiking due to the American embargo. Better to declare war and have a small chance of victory than to accept the conditions of defeat without even fighting. But finally, Tojo and his new foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, emerged with a last-ditch effort for peace. They would make two proposals to Roosevelt, Proposal A and Proposal B. In Proposal A, Japan would agree to negotiate an end to the Sino-Japanese War, make an initial troop drawdown, and withdraw all troops from China over a 25-year period. And in Proposal B, Japan would immediately reverse its troop movements to the southern portion of Indochina, freeze military deployments in Southeast Asia, and pledge to remove all troops from Indochina once the war in China was concluded. In return, America would end its aid to nationalist China, sell Japan oil, and broker trade agreements for rubber and other materials. Of course, they had greater hopes for Proposal B, since it was more concrete, immediate, and managed to avoid the thorny issue of China. The plan was to give Roosevelt Proposal A, then if it was declined, present Proposal B, and if both were turned down, it would be war. The military pressed for a new deadline, a date after which diplomacy was considered to have failed. Tojo managed to haggle almost a month out of them. So on November 5th, as Kurusu boarded his train, Tojo and his ministers sat down with Emperor Hirohito for a new imperial conference. They outlined the proposals, the dire costs of the American embargo, and the proposed attack on Pearl Harbor. The emperor gave his assent. If peace was not found by December 1st, the attack would go ahead. The next day, when Nomura presented Proposal A to Secretary of State Hull, he found him unenthusiastic. That was pretty much expected. What wasn't expected, however, was that Hull and Roosevelt would take until November 14th to formally turn it down. So much later than anticipated, Nomura and Kurusu tried Proposal B. What they didn't know at that juncture, however, was that Hull already knew about this alternate proposal. Because over at the Magic program, its staff of military officers and code-breaking women, known as Code Girls, had already intercepted and deciphered the proposals when they were sent to Nomura via the Purple Code. So not only had Hull read both proposals, but he also read the government's instructions to Nomura about how to present them, which rubbed him the wrong way. See, while the Magic program was good at cracking Japanese codes, they were bad at translation. The program was underfunded, understaffed, and had no native Japanese speakers. And because diplomatic communications were conducted in formal Japanese, the resulting translations, while substantively accurate, appeared harsher and more demanding than the originals. Translators also inserted and removed words and phrases, making it appear like there was no room to maneuver, with basic errors like substituting the phrase "final concessions" with the more provocative "ultimatum." Seriously, you put these things side by side, and it is pretty glaring. Hull was also, by this time, simply disinclined to believe anything Japan said. Its horrifying massacres in China and obvious preparations to invade Southeast Asia, confirmed again by the Purple Intercepts, meant that despite his friendship with Nomura, he considered the negotiations untrustworthy. Not to mention, Hull also disliked Kurusu, seeing him as a Nazi ally, since he'd signed the Tripartite Act on behalf of Japan. So Hull and Roosevelt slow-walked their response to Proposition B, considering it carefully, as they also tracked Japanese forces moving into position outside of Hong Kong, in Indochina, and in ports across Japan. Purple intercepts and phone taps made it clear that Japan was talking peace, but preparing for war. To them, it appeared Japan was using diplomacy to stall their way to a better military position, and they were right. Secrecy around the Pearl Harbor attacks was incredibly tight, and the cabinet had specifically agreed to keep diplomats like Nomura and Kurusu out of the loop to make the bluff more convincing. Ensign Yoshikawa, the spy embedded in the Honolulu consulate from the episode earlier, didn't actually know either. He only knew he was supposed to pump drunk Marines for information and to skin dive at night in the harbor channel looking for submarine nets. Increasingly, he was told to create a grid map of the harbor and cable what ships were berthed in which sections. It was clear to intelligence groups, both in the US and Britain, that Japanese forces were preparing to hit something, but what? Singapore? The Philippines? The Dutch East Indies maybe? Perhaps some combination. That last one seemed the most likely. And for months, British and Dutch diplomats had begged Roosevelt for even a verbal agreement that the three powers would fight together should they be attacked. But still, Hull and Roosevelt remained evasive. An agreement was premature. They were still negotiating with Japan. However, they did send out an alert to US forces in the Philippines, Midway, Wake, and Hawaii that a conflict might be coming. However, this warning was so vague that individual commanders interpreted it in wildly different ways. In the Philippines, it was seen as a caution that ships might strike Singapore, in which case America may need to provide air support. While at Pearl Harbor, it was seen as a warning of possible sabotage by the local Japanese-American population. An air commander responded by grouping planes close together on the runway where they were easier to guard and easier to bomb. But no one in the Roosevelt administration, apart from a few outliers, truly considered Pearl a target for a Japanese strike. To do it, the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to sail far north into freezing waters before turning down into the mid-Pacific tropics. They'd risk exposure if they were spotted by even a single merchant ship, aircraft, or PBY Catalina patrols out of Midway, and a surprise carrier-based air raid at such long range had never been done before. "We assumed they had good sense," said one American commander after the war. Another admitted in racist terms that they simply didn't think the Japanese had the capability. Given the fleet movements, Roosevelt scrapped his more conciliatory counterproposal, and instead, he and Hull drew up a list of 10 hardball points, known as the Hull Note, including a full Japanese troop withdrawal from China and Indochina, abandonment of the Tripartite Pact, and to cease supporting puppet governments in China. Then, Japan could return to most favored nation status, and both countries would leave China. And they delivered that to Nomura November 26th. On December 2nd, an undetected fleet under Admiral Nagumo, already a third of its way to Hawaii, received a coded message from Yamamoto. Climb Mount Niitaka. The code that diplomacy had failed, and that the attack would begin. Japanese Consulate, Honolulu, Tuesday, December 2nd, 1941. Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa senses war closing in. A delegation of Japanese specialists had come to survey Pearl Harbor, leaving him a list of questions, and he found the answers to them via observation, gossip, and local media reports. But now, a message comes from Tokyo, ordering him to report daily what ships are in port, whether the harbor has barrage balloons, if there are any anti-torpedo nets. Yes, his mission is definitely nearing its end. He even passed some espionage duties to a German-American agent loyal to Nazi Germany. Still, each day he listens to the weather report on Radio Tokyo, waiting to hear these specific words: east wind, rain. The coded message that meant Japan was at war with the United States. And he won't have to wait long, for Admiral Nagumo's strike force is already a third of the way to Hawaii. Wednesday, December 3rd, the Oval Office. Roosevelt has been meeting regularly with Navy leadership. Japanese fleets are moving into Southeast Asia, but no one knows what the target is. One group of 6 carriers has simply disappeared. The general consensus is that Japan will strike Malaya, Hong Kong, or the Dutch East Indies within days. Some even fear that they're planning a surprise attack on the Philippines, though that's a minority opinion. Roosevelt then meets with the British ambassador and finally gives him the answer he's been begging for. If Japan attacks British or Dutch territory, America will support their fight. Later that day, Stanley Jones, an old friend of Roosevelt and a missionary to Japan, visits him, and in his pocket is one last gambit for peace, cooked up by Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Caruso, using Jones to get around the increasingly hostile Cordell Hull. Caruso wants Roosevelt to go over the heads of the militarists and cable the emperor directly, offering to negotiate an end to the war in China. Hull dislikes this idea. The FBI has reported smoke at the Japanese embassy. They're already burning documents. War could start any minute. Though, after considering, Roosevelt decides he will send the cable. One last chance at peace. And if he had sent it that day, it might have arrived in time to make a difference. Instead, he'll send it the evening of December 6th. Thursday, December 4th, Tokyo. For hours, Tojo's cabinet has been drafting a response to Hull's list of demands that we mentioned last episode, and the reply they're crafting is a 14-point statement of grievances, with the last one being the most crucial, saying America's position has made further negotiation impossible. It severs diplomatic relations with war inferred rather than declared. The foreign minister hates this. He insists the statement be delivered before the strike. The honor of Japan depends on it. Yeah, the Navy says they'll get back to him on timing. The timing of the attack is still secret after all. And then, a full day later, they finally respond. The statement must be delivered at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time. They also say the foreign ministry should wait and send the 14th part, the one breaking off relations, until just hours before the attack. Saturday, December 6th, Washington. Dorothy Edgers is a Japanese translator in the Navy's cryptographic section and is working the weekend to catch up on magic intercepts. The program is understaffed, subject to Army-Navy turf battles, and, frankly, intercepts more than they can decode and translate. Now there's some low-priority messages out of Honolulu that need seeing to. Of course, those communications are probably mostly commercial rather than diplomatic, but she's not one to let things stack up. She sees one from December 2nd, where Tokyo asks about barrage balloons and torpedo nets, then a reply the next day about a German agent in Hawaii. But when the head of the translation section, Lieutenant Commander Alvin D. Kramer, arrives that afternoon, he isn't alarmed. Edgers is new to this work. He's seen stuff like this before. Japanese consulates monitor ship traffic at every port. He mostly nitpicks her rough translation, then decides it isn't good enough to pass on. Go enjoy your weekend, he says. We'll finish this up on Monday. Meanwhile, across town at the Japanese embassy, the first 13 parts of the statement start to come in. But there's a goodbye party for one of the embassy staff, and the senior secretary only gets partway through the decryption before he's pulled into a ping-pong tournament. And the history books don't tell us whether he won or not. But back at the Navy cryptographic office, Kramer now also receives the 13-point statement, intercepted when it was sent to the Japanese embassy. Recognizing its importance, he jumps up, and not having a staff car, gets his wife to drive him to the White House. Reading the statement and its belligerent tone, Roosevelt then says, "This means war." As emergency calls go out, with military officials being pulled out of theaters and called away from dinner parties, everyone in Washington now knows something's up. Sunday, December 7th. Around 8 a.m. Washington time, the 14th and final part of the statement breaking off relations, and the instructions saying it must be presented to Hull at exactly 1 p.m., arrives at the Japanese embassy. And as before, it too is intercepted, and Kramer gets a decrypted copy. And when he sees there's a delivery time specified in the instructions, his bad feeling gets much worse. Meanwhile, at the Japanese embassy, Nomura is freaking out. The decryption staff has all gone home to nurse hangovers, and it's 10 a.m. before he can get anyone back to decrypt the instructions. And that's when he finds out about the 1 p.m. delivery time. That is not enough time to work this document. He has to carefully translate this formal declaration to English before presenting it to Hull. Okay, panicking, he calls Hull's office. Can he please get a 1 p.m. appointment?
Oh, sorry, sir. Secretary Hull has a lunch meeting. Could you possibly do 2 p.m.?
No. He insists it must be no later than 1 p.m., and with that, gets the appointment. Nomura hovers over his senior secretary, as the man, who can't type mind you, it's more of a hunt and peck kind of action, translates the first 13 parts of the statement from Japanese to English. He finishes, but there are so many errors, it's nearly illegible. They start retyping the entire thing. Meanwhile, American leaders are frantic over the possible significance of the 1 p.m. delivery of that last ominous message. Why so specific? Was an attack imminent? Sabotage, perhaps? They send warnings to the Philippines and the Panama Canal, but weather conditions mean that Hawaii can't be raised. And with phone messages possibly being tapped, exposing the fact that the purple code is broken, they instead opt to send a Western Union telegram. They forget to mark it urgent. At 6:30 a.m. Hawaiian time, at the mouth of Pearl Harbor, a destroyer spots the conning tower of a submarine. They sink it, and then send a warning to headquarters, though it's dismissed. After all, jumpy captains were always mistaking driftwood or turtle heads for periscopes. Then at 7:06 a.m. Hawaiian time, a radar unit picks up a wave of airplanes inbound. They call it in and are told not to worry. It's a flight of B-17s transferring in. They're just early. Meanwhile, in Washington, it's 12:30 p.m. and Nomura is losing his mind. It's only 30 minutes until they're meeting with Hull, and he's just been handed the decrypted 14th part breaking off relations. In addition, Tokyo has just sent corrections to the first 13 parts of the statement, and now multiple pages have to be retyped. They're going to be late for their 1 p.m. delivery. In Honolulu, civilians wake in confusion. Smoke rises over Pearl Harbor, and airplanes buzz across the sky. Okay, what idiot scheduled a big naval exercise on a Sunday morning of all times? Yoshikawa knows different. He rushes to the consulate just in time to hear the weather report. East wind, rain. 10 minutes after he's done torching his codebooks and all evidence of espionage, armed FBI agents break down the door. He raises his hands and identifies himself as a diplomat. Now, much later, he'll return to Japan on a diplomatic exchange, his activities not revealed until decades later. Rather, Japanese Americans, who he never enlisted as agents because he found them too loyal to the US, will be blamed instead. Washington, 2:20 p.m. Nomura and Kurusu enter Hull's office. They don't know that 15 minutes earlier, Roosevelt had informed Hull of the ongoing attack at Pearl Harbor, an attack neither diplomat knows about. Nomura stretches out his hand, but Hull does not take it. Instead, he flips through the 14-point statement and icily asks why it had to be delivered at 1 p.m. Nomura, apologizing for being late, says he doesn't know. And it's at this point that Hull launches into Nomura. In all of their dealings, he says, he's always been honest and straightforward. And he'd hoped Nomura did the same. Yet now, here, he brings this statement full of lies and distortions. Then, Hull dismisses them. Nomura, still confused, reaches out his hand to shake once more. This time, Hull accepts. Then they exit the office into a mob of press. The next day, Roosevelt would use their late delivery of the statement as part of his Day of Infamy speech. A speech that created a clean, righteous narrative out of the complicated, multi-decade breakdown of American-Japanese relations. A story that began in the 19th century as two Pacific empires took their first tentative steps towards each other in a dance of imperial cooperation and collision, and a story that would be burned into the popular consciousness under 3 powerful words. Remember Pearl Harbor. Actually, on that note of remembrance, did you extra historians know that this series only exists because the Rome Total War team asked the Extra Credits crew to do a video to promote their game way back in 2013? Yeah, and here we are like 700 episodes later, getting to help them celebrate their 25th silver anniversary with a huge sale on every game in their Grand Strategy series. I mean, look at all of these Total War titles. There's stuff like Shogun, Medieval, Napoleon, Pharaoh, Three Kingdoms, Warhammer, and tons more. So if you'd like to command epic battles on your own and learn the history around them, click the link below or scan the QR code right over there. Then, when you play, you'll be joining us in celebrating Extra History's, well, history. Once again, to get a deep discount on all the games in the Total War series, click here, and then once you've gathered your forces, check out another of our videos here. A legendary thanks to Angelo Valenciana, Dominic Valenciana, Friso Fansanton, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's Architectures for being the best legendary patrons.